content may be disturbing to some viewers. Enjoy at your own expense.
The Canadian Directorate for Ecological Aberration Response and Territorial Harmony proudly presents After Hours in the Wilderness. This is a mandatory safety briefing for visitors remaining in designated wilderness zones beyond the recommended threshold time of 7:35 p.m. Environmental assessments have concluded that past this hour, ecological conditions in select regions become unstable. Unexplained auditory phenomena, visual distortions, spatial inconsistencies, and incidents of hyperviolence have been reported with increased frequency. While these events remain within expected seasonal variance, specific protocols must be followed to ensure public safety and territorial integrity. Remain in groups. Solitary movement increases risk of disorientation and emotional disruption.
Very sharp knife.
Do not engage with unknown individuals. If approached, do not respond. Do not accept assistance. Do not engage with unidentified vocalizations. Instances of human-like speech originating from non-visible sources have been documented in post-field reports. These vocalizations may mimic known individuals or express distress. Do not answer. Do not investigate. Monitor hunger and body temperature closely. Sudden changes may indicate proximity to biologically disruptive zones. Do not leave marked paths. Trails may shift. Time perception may degrade. Trust only.
Cupping the wooden bowl in her hands, she felt the cold leave her fingers. She shuddered and brought its edge to her lips. The dark liquid swirled, revealing small chunks of grayish meat. She fought back the urge to gag. The man standing above the group turned his attention to her with an inquisitive gaze. She searched for her resolve in that moment and found nothing. What had she become? What would be left after this? She knew only hunger now. Desperate, unwavering hunger. A growl in her stomach betrayed the revulsion she felt in her mind. Closing her eyes, she lifted the bowl to her lips and took a sip. Hot melted snow and the fragrance of juniper berries was pleasant as it passed down her throat. She opened her eyes and saw golden rivulets of fat shimmering on the stew's surface, breaking into glossy pools. She remembered the man's face, alive and smiling just hours earlier. A piece of gristle touched her tongue in the second sip. The bowl nearly fell from her hands as she retched and vomited onto the cold earth in front of her. The man dressed in black snatched the bowl from her hands before she could drop it. He raised it to his sullen face, inhaling the aroma deeply. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything, he said without looking up from the bowl. He lifted it to his lips and began to drink greedily. Brown liquid streamed from his cheeks. He threw the piece of solid wood against the nearest wall, startling those closest to its impact. Have you learned nothing, child? Are these gifts that God has given us in these most trying times simply not enough for you? He spoke with a tone of barely concealed malice. The young woman bowed her head and began to sob. Someone seated nearby placed a comforting hand on her back. The man in black moved to the large cast iron pot affixed atop the fire burning at the back of the room. He spooned another fixed serving into a new bowl and turned back to face the woman seated on the dirt. He knelt and held out the steaming bowl to her face. She raised her head to look him in the eyes, trying her best to ignore the bowl. Eat, child, he said calmly. Tears welled in her eyes as her trembling hands reached up to receive the offering. The liquid splashed as she slowly brought it to her lips once more. Everyone in the room was silent, watching with bated breath. She took one last painstaking sip before she gagged and dropped the bowl in reflex, spilling the contents on the ground at the feet of the man standing above her. He smiled, almost appearing pleased. "The purity of your soul may be lost, but the godliness in your flesh remains, dear child," he said without moving from the pool of stew at his feet. "Please, I didn't mean to." The man in black made a single knowing glance to someone behind her. She felt two pairs of strong hands grab each of her arms, violently jerking her to her feet. "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The woman pleaded desperately and began to scream as she was dragged out of the room and into the cold, black night.
In the early 16th century, French explorers landed on the eastern shores of what we now call Canada. They found an untamed world, unspoiled by man's ambitions. It was unlike anything the explorers had ever seen before. It was here that they encountered the
At the river, 4 of those who still had the strength to brave the cold found themselves casting nets for several hours to no avail. Accompanying them was the man known as Matu, sitting far away against a bank of snow, huddled in his furs. The 4 Frenchmen sweated and groaned as they pulled in one empty net after another. Large sheets of ice floated down the river, bobbing with the gentle current. Trout was once an easy catch at this portion of the river, even during the colder months. Now there was precious little life to be seen at all. From the waters to the woods, game hadn't been seen in the area around their settlement for the better part of a month. Tensions were high. Food stores were running low, and there was no easy way to get a message out to the French fort close to the St. Lawrence. The situation was beginning to look dire for the 50-odd souls staking out a life for themselves in this remote part of New France. "Hoi, bird skin! Are you planning on sitting on your arse all afternoon? Or are you going to floor a damn net?" he yelled out to Matu further up the river. The man was Michel, the largest of the 4 standing by the bank. He grunted and spat before returning to his struggle with the fishing line tangled in a collection of driftwood. "He's probably praying to his sky spirits to open up and rain down fish on us, eh?" 2 of the other men laughed. "No, he's waiting for something," another voice said. Paul raised his hand to block the sun and squinted at Matu. I can hardly see him in that little blind he's made. Paul was the youngest of the group. He was a skinner by trade and had little skill casting nets in the frozen waters. Good. Maybe the earth will swallow him up and we could be rid of him. Michel snickered before forcefully yanking his line from the driftwood, snapping it. Fichu! He shouted, tossing his tackle into the snow behind him. Matu sat completely still. He was staring at a wedge of crabapple just outside a thicket of brush, some 10 meters away from him. His fingers held slight tension on the string of his bow, its shaft resting atop his knee. He breathed deeply. Something rustled within the brush, the sound of crushed snow and tiny twigs being pushed aside. Using slow, even pressure, he drew back the string, raising the arrowhead several centimeters above his knee. Another rustle from within the brush. Something sniffed at the fruit on the ground. The arrow disappeared within the snow-dusted foliage, knocking loose the white powder as it traveled within. He rose from his nest, shook the snow from his furs, and worked the rigidness out of his muscles. He made his way into the brush to retrieve his prize. A rabbit, young and skinny. He knelt beside it and said a silent prayer of thanks before removing the arrow. He tied its feet together and slung it over his back before waving at Paul further down the bank. Paul waved back just before Matu turned and moved into the woods toward their settlement. Michel noticed the rabbit on his back. His fury was immediate. He kicked at the wooden box that housed their fishing nets. Que le diable t'importe? He raged. Paul sighed and turned his attention back to his net, floating silently in the stream. He saw a splash in the water and felt a tug. He quickly pulled on the ropes to close the net and dragged it out onto the bank. He grinned from ear to ear. 2 trout flopped in the bank inside of his net. He cheered and hugged the man standing closest to him. God looks down on us today. He turned to see Michel towering above him, and his smile faded. There's enough for all of us. We can stay and catch more too, Paul said. He knew he was being optimistic at best. And tomorrow, what will I eat then? Will you catch me more tomorrow? He was standing very close to Paul now. Well, if we work together, then we... Paul noticed the rock he held in his large hand. He felt a chill, but not from the cord. Michel, Paul took a step back. I'm starting to think that we have too many mouths to feed. My belly growls as I watch your wife and idiot son scarf down what little we have left. Michel took another step forward. Paul's hand twitched. He glanced at the gutting knife beside the wooden box to his right. He stared Michel in the eyes again. The others were stepping away, careful not to catch the furious gaze of the larger of the 2 men. Paul shoved Michel with his shoulder, knocking him off balance. He scrambled for the knife and gripped it with both hands. He swung to brandish it. The rock crashed against his skull with a crack. He fell against the smooth stones lining the bank. Blood trickled down the side of his face. His eyes took on the same glossy indifference as the pair of trout lying next to him.
French settlers began arriving in greater numbers. They sought wealth, land, and comforts. The First Nations had survived and thrived here for thousands of years. The Algonquin, Innu, Huron, and Iroquois were among them. Each had distinct languages, customs, and beliefs. In 1632, Jesuit priest Paul Lejeune arrived in New France, sought to convert the native people.
On the 9th of February, a savage named Atikamegu and surnamed the Prince by our Frenchman. Having camped quite near Notre-Dame-des-Anges, sent post-haste for one of our fathers to baptize a little boy of his, who was dying. The father took a little water with him, fearing he might not find any in their bark house, as the cold had frozen the brooks and rivers. He hurried as fast as he could, and finally, all out of breath, arrived at the place where lay the child, who was on the verge of death. His father begged that he should be made a Christian before his death. His mother opposed this, saying quite harshly that she did not wish him to be baptized, and that all those who were baptized would die. She was told that all the French were baptized, and named some of their own tribe who also had been, and who nevertheless enjoyed perfect health, that if some savages died after baptism, it did not result from the sacrament, but from the disease, which would not fail to kill them even if they were not baptized, as she could see in the cases of some who had died without receiving this sacrament. Her husband chided her. "It is baptism," said he, "that makes thy son die now, and yet he lays there dying. I wish him to be a Christian." The mother continued to object, for the child was approaching near to death, being hardly able to breathe. The father, on his part, urged the mother, assuring her that baptism not only did not make one die, but on the contrary sometimes restored the life of the body and the life of the soul together, and that if she would believe God could perform this wonder, her son might recover. Instantly upon hearing this suggestion, the woman begins to open her ears. "If thou canst cure him," she replies, "baptize him. If not, do not touch him. As for me," says the father of the child, "I believe that he who has made all can cure him." "If thy wife had the same belief," said someone, "thou wouldst soon see thy son alive." He began to urge her. "Thou hast no sense. Thou fearest that baptism will make him die, and thou seest he is dying without baptism. He who has made all and can do all is strong enough to restore their life to him. And even if he does not restore him, he will at least have pity on his soul." "Let him baptize him then," said the mother. "Take courage," replied her husband, "and consider well if thou believest, for if thou liest in thy heart, God will not cure thy child." "I believe," said she. "Let them baptize him." The father found himself in a rather difficult position, for he understood perfectly that this woman gave consent to the baptism of her child only in the hope of his recovery, and that consequently, if the child died, which all were expecting, she would be certain to greatly decry this sacrament. Nevertheless, as he could not see him die before his eyes, he resolved to baptize him, asking the parents, in case he recovered, to give him to us when he grew larger, to instruct him. At this request, the mother again became obstinate. "I see plainly that he wishes to have my son. He shall not have him." Her husband, turning towards the father, said, "Dost thou ask my son for all time, or simply to instruct him?" "I only want to instruct him, and not that until he is 6 or 7 years old." "Baptize him, thou canst have him." And urging his wife, he assured her that they would restore her child, when he should be well instructed, in case God granted him health. The savages who were there were surprised that there should be any discussion about a child who was in the throes of death. "There he lies dying, and you are debating as to who shall have him." "In fact," said his father, "he is dead if baptism does not restore him." They were again assured that, if they believed that God was powerful enough and good enough to restore life to their child, he would do it. At last the mother herself presents him for baptism, as an evidence of her faith and of her hope. The child is baptized on the instant, without ceremony and without giving him a name, because the malady did not permit more. Strange to say, the father who baptized him had no sooner finished pronouncing the holy words, pouring a little water over this poor infant's head, which his mother uncovered, than he opened his eyes, began to breathe, to stretch, and to move about in his little portable cradle. A mother, completely beside herself, offered him the West, which he could not take before, he now took without difficulty. And before the father departed from the cabin, he had entirely recovered. Some savages hastening in, the father of the child told them what had occurred, and they were struck dumb with amazement. Now this little Christian is fine-looking and plump, the joy of his parents and the admiration of those who saw him in his sickness.
In the event that at least 3 out of the 4 biological markers of the are detected within your immediate vicinity, follow these protocols precisely. These measures are designed to
Matu picked his way through the brush along a path that he alone used. He found the trails the Frenchmen had beaten out of the land to be inefficient means to travel. They preferred their roads for their neatness alone. He didn't understand many things about his new people, yet he asked few questions. He learned very quickly that unless he was benefiting them, he was viewed as a burden, and his life among them had been simplified to just that. Despite the many winters he had survived with them, he was never going to be one of them, and he accepted that fact. This was his home now, for better or for worse. He found that some were kinder to him than others. The spiritual leader, the man who wore black, was frightening to Matu when he first met him. Yet he quickly became his first friend. Yet thin lips and a wide smile, he smelled of fresh-cut sage and smoke. He had a handsome yet fleeting youth about him. His robes were always kept immaculately clean. He had introduced himself to Matu as Father Jean. He found that the others in the settlement listened to his voice above all, even those older than him. Father Jean had offered Matu a place to stay after discovering him lingering near the edges of their settlement, gaunt and teetering on the brink of starvation. He was later told that the name he had been given meant tomcat in their language, though only some use that word endearingly. He was instructed in their language in the ways of the French by Father Jean. He was young enough that learning a new language came easily to him. Father Jean often encouraged him to speak about his life before living with them, but Matu found most of those memories too painful to relive. Father Jean never pressed Matu on his reluctance to share his past, but reminded him that he would always be willing to listen. Something about his nature was both comforting and confusing to Matu. He often spoke as if he was reciting from something he had always known and always would know. And with him at all times he carried a wooden effigy strung onto a beaded necklace and a small book written in a language Matu didn't understand. The others, however, would sit and listen to him read from that book for hours inside the biggest house in the settlement. Yet strangest of all was that not a single person lived in this house, at least not one that he could see. However, Matu learned long ago not to question things such as this, as the very act of answering him seemed to burden the soul of the Frenchman. So he stayed his tongue. He had been offered the smallest of the homes in the settlement after his second winter living amongst them, although he soon realized that the home had once been used for livestock, and kindly refused. He slept in a tent of his own making on the forest edge. He had become very comfortable living in solitude, finding that the less he was present, the more the French seemed to appreciate him and his skills. He made his way to the building where Paul and another man worked to skin and dress their kills. He knew it would be some time before Paul and the others made it back from the river, so he untied the rabbit and left it on a table within. Louise, Paul's wife, was waiting outside to greet him. "Any luck today, monsieur?" Her voice was warm and her face was kind. showing not a single line of stress. Huddled beside her was their son, Olivier. He was among only a handful of children in the settlement. He could remember scant few times where he had actually heard the child speak, yet he seemed to confide in Mathieu in some way. Olivier skirted over to him and started tugging at the axe he had fashioned to his belt. The belt was a gift from Paul. He reached out to dust the snow from the little one's head. Something about his small face always stung Mathieu with a twinge of sadness he couldn't explain. He pushed the feeling aside, as he always did. "A rabbit may be the last one we see for a while. Even they seem to be suffering now," he responded. Olivier tugged at the axe again. He always had a fascination with the many tools Mathieu carried with him. He dug into his satchel and pulled out a small depiction of a wolf head, carved out of a hunk of cedar. Olivier's face lit up with excitement as he took the toy from his hand, howling as he ran. Louise frowned. "I hope he catches something today, even if it's small. He's felt like he hasn't been providing enough, and he sulks all evening." "You will, if we hold out a little longer. The spring will be even more bountiful, I'm sure of it." He placed a hand on her shoulder as he passed. Louise smiled and followed after the sound of Olivier's barking. "Therefore take no thought, saying, 'What shall we eat?' or 'What shall we drink?' or 'Wherewithal shall we be clothed?' For your heavenly Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Father Jean was dressed in his thickest coat. Flecks of snow clung to his eyebrows and dusted his dark hair. His cheekbones protruded sharply through tight, pallid skin. His hands were turning pink from the cold as he held the book and his necklace out for those sitting in front of him to see clearly. The conviction in his words stirred something even in Mathieu. He always enjoyed listening to Father Jean speak, if nothing else. A woman in the group dropped to her knees and looked up at him. Mathieu could see tears running her bright red cheeks. She clasped her hands together and started muttering something. He could have counted every bone in her hands and wrist. Father Jean knelt and touched his forehead to hers. "Our faith is being tested, yes, but God giveth just as he taketh away." We stood and looked out to those who still listened to the sermon. The settlers shivered under their blankets. "We must not stray from our shepherd, especially not now. It is times such as these that the strength of our faith is measured, and we must not be found to be lacking." Mathieu stuffed his hands into the furs that swaddled him, warming them against his bare chest. Father Jean raised his voice and looked to the sky. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God, and I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." The glow left his eyes, and his expression became gray as he noticed a commotion emerging from the entrance to the settlement. Mathieu turned, and what he saw dug a pit into his stomach. 3 figures, with their heads bowed, carried something large wrapped in cloth. Someone close to them screamed as they carried the limp mass toward the building where they treated the sick. Father Jean walked in after them with a slow, even stride. Mathieu could see the whites of his knuckles where he clutched the necklace. "Slipped on the ice and he hit his head on a rock," one of those who had returned said. Mathieu stood just outside, observing the crowd within. He saw Michel, his broad shoulders visible above the men and women crowding in now. He was looking away from the mass, and Matthew noticed the muscles in his jaw clench and release incessantly. Michel stood in silence as a bead of sweat formed on his thick, furrowed brow. Father Jean gently pushed his way through the crowd to stand by one of the oldest of the Frenchmen. The man had hair as white as the snow and wore discs of glass on his face held together by a thin wire of metal. The old man pulled the cloth back from the top of the mask to reveal Paul's face. His eyes stared upward at the ceiling. The room seemed to gasp and a woman screamed, "No, no, God, no!" Batu felt a rush of emotion. He had witnessed death before, but the pain of losing his friend overwhelmed him. He forced himself to look away. He turned and saw Louise rush into the building. The crowd parted as she ran to her husband. Her wailing was the loudest of all. Batu felt a stake of ice being pushed deeper into his heart. He saw Olivier shuffling his way to the back of the crowd. He held the wood carving in his hand, limp. Batu grabbed him before he could enter, lifting him and burying his face into the fur so that he could not see. But the boy knew. Batu was sure of it. He was sure of it even before he felt the little tears wet his neck. Many of the settlers dropped to their knees at the feet of Father Jean, pleading for answers. Father Jean stood motionless, his mouth a thin line and his hands no longer shaking. He stared into Paul's eyes. The fire in his heart reduced to smoldering embers.
If we begin with physical advantages, I will say that they possess these in abundance. They are tall, erect, strong, well-proportioned, agile, and there's nothing effeminate in their appearance. Those little fops that are seen elsewhere are only caricatures of men compared with our savages. As to the mind of the savage, it is of good quality. I believe that souls are all made from the same stock, and that they do not materially differ. Hence, these barbarians having well-formed bodies and organs well-regulated and well-arranged, their minds ought to work with ease. Education and instruction alone are lacking. Their soul is a soil which is naturally good, but loaded down with all the evils that a land abandoned since the birth of the world can produce. I naturally compare our savages with certain villages, because both are usually without education, though our peasants are superior in this regard, and yet I have not seen anyone thus far of those who have come to this country who does not confess and frankly admit that the savages are more intelligent than our ordinary peasants. Moreover, if it is a great blessing to be free from a great evil, our savages are happy. For the two tyrants who provide hell and torture for many of our Europeans do not reign in a great forest. I mean ambition and avarice, as they have neither political organization nor offices nor dignitaries nor any authority. For they only obey their chief through goodwill toward him. Therefore they never kill each other to acquire these honors. Also, they are contented with a mere living. Not one of them gives himself to the devil to acquire wealth. They make a pretense of never getting angry, not because of the beauty of this virtue, for which they have not even a name, but for their own contentment and happiness. I mean, to avoid the bitterness caused by anger. The sorcerer said to me one day, speaking of one of our Frenchmen, "He has no sense. He gets angry. As for me, nothing can disturb me. Let hunger oppress me. Let my nearest relation pass to the other life. Let the Iroquois or our enemies massacre our people. I never get angry." What he says is not an article of faith, for as he is more haughty than any other savage, so I have seen him oftener out of humor than any of them. It is true also that he often restrains and governs himself by force, especially when I expose his foolishness. I have only heard one savage pronounce this word, Ninichakadayan. I am angry, and he only said it once. But I notice that they keep their eyes on him. But when these barbarians are angry, they are dangerous and unrestrained. Whoever professes not to get angry ought also to make a profession of patience. The savages surpass us to such an extent in this respect that we ought to be ashamed. I saw them, in their hardships and in their labors, suffer with cheerfulness. My host, wondering at the great number of people who I told him were in France, asked me if the men were good, if they did not become angry, if they were patient. I've never seen such patience as is shown by a Sikh savage. You may yell, storm, jump, dance, and he will scarcely ever complain. I found myself with them threatened with great suffering. They said to me, "We shall be sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3 without eating. For lack of food, take courage. Jehimne, let thy soul be strong to endure suffering and hardship. Keep thyself from being sad, otherwise thou wilt be sick. See how we do not cease to laugh, although we have little to eat. One thing alone casts them down. It is when they see death, for they fear this beyond measure. Take away this apprehension from the savages, and they will endure all kinds of degradation and discomfort, and all kinds of trials and suffering very patiently. They are very much attached to each other and agree admirably. You do not see any disputes, quarrels, enmities, or reproaches among them. They are very generous amongst themselves, and even make a show of not loving anything, of not being attached to the riches of the earth, so that they may not grieve if they lose them. Not long ago, a dog tore a beautiful beaver robe belonging to one of the savages, and he was the first one to laugh about it. One of the greatest insults that can be offered to them is to say, "That man likes everything. He is stingy." If you refuse them anything, here is their reproach, as I remarked last year. Ki sakiten, sakita. Thou lovest that, love it as much as thou wilt.
Matu thrust the shovel into the ground, throwing a pile of dirt over his shoulder that was stiff and small. Matu and 3 Frenchmen, one of whom had been at the river that day, continued making a grave for Paul. All of them knew that the ground would be too hard to dig. Something about their persistence in honoring their rituals was admirable to him. They struck the frozen earth with such force, Matu thought they must feel Paul's spirit lingering above them, awaiting his final resting place. Finally, with a collective sigh of resignation, the men fell to rest beside the shallow hole they had dug. Matu wiped the sweat from his brow, leaning against his shovel. "This is hopeless. It'll be dark soon, and we haven't made a hole big enough to take a shit in," one of them said. The one who had been by the river when Paul fell carried on. He was the skinniest among them, even before the winter had begun. A vein in his forehead bulged, and he wheezed as he tossed bits of cold earth behind him. Matu squinted at the man. There was something in his face he couldn't quite identify, but he sensed it lurking beneath the glistening sweat. "Jacques, enough," a Frenchman in a long coat with frayed edges said. Jacques continued to dig, increasing his pace. Grimacing, he thrust the shovel into the earth over and over. The wooden shaft of the tool slipped from his grip and he toppled over, landing halfway inside the hole. Matu saw his hands were bleeding. The man in the coat spat and made a sound that Matu registered as pity before he and his son walked back to the settlement, leaving Matu alone with Jacques. The small Frenchman remained in a heap on the ground, blankly staring at the space in front of him. Matu lowered himself to sit beside the man, who made no sign he was even aware of his presence. Matu was silent for a moment. In his mind, he was struggling to find the right words to say. He knew there may not be anything he could say. "He didn't deserve this," Jacques said after a long stretch of silence. While Jacques' eyes remained fixed on the grave, Matu turned to look at him. The wind howled through the long creeping branches overhead. He used to tell me he was going to plant an apple orchard. Jacques' hands were trembling. He said that by the time they fruited, our sons would be old enough to make cider for us. He looked away, a tear falling from his cheek and onto the dark earth. Matu smiled slightly. He showed me where he was going to plant it. There's a clearing further down the river. He said he was going to plant 100 trees just to start. Jacques chuckled, remembering Paul's confident naivety, and wiped his eyes dry. They wrapped Paul's body once more, in a finer cloth this time, and placed it inside one of the frozen storerooms that had been eaten through a week prior. Matu was aware of the deep upset this caused the French. Having witnessed their burial ceremonies before, he knew that their grief wouldn't start until they laid the body to rest and Father Jean blessed it. Father Jean held an impromptu ceremony for his passing, although only a few could fit inside of the cramped storeroom. Matu stood with the others outside as Father Jean read from his book and dropped water onto the cloth covering Paul's forehead. Louise's voice had become hoarse from wailing, and she no longer cried. She sat silently, her hand resting on the smooth cloth above where she thought her husband's would be. Her face was devoid of any sign of life. Olivier was huddled next to Matu. He had refused to stand by Father Jean and the body. None had the will to discipline him. Louise sat beside the bulbous shape on the ground that was once her husband, long after the others had left. On the third day after Paul's death, a snowstorm swept over their valley. Thick white powder covered every home and blocked every door. Only the day after did most settlers venture out from their homes in search of wood for their stoves. A single root cellar held the last of their food stores, and the snow had swaddled the entrance. It took 2 men nearly an hour to dig inside, but they discovered much of the grain had rotten. Rats had already had their fill of what was left. They managed to find enough to fill 2 sacks with grain and vegetables, leaving a bundle at the door of each of the homes where light could still be seen within. Father Jean continued to hold his daily prayers in the clearing in front of the storehouses, though fewer attended each time. With insufficient firewood for every home, many found themselves sharing warmth and food with neighbors, huddled tightly together inside their tiny cabins. Father Jean often stood alone in the cold as flecks of snow fell from the white sky and landed gently on his dark robes. With palms upturned, he stretched his hands to the sky, as though awaiting to receive something. His sermons alternated between unintelligible muttering and long stretches of silence beneath the fickle warmth of the sun. As the days went on, only a handful of settlers were able to venture out, and they spoke little to one another. Matu had seen this before, and he knew the settlement had little time left. Shortly before nightfall on the 5th day following Paul's death, Matu noticed a commotion stirring in the settlement. After adding a few more branches to his small fire, he rose from his tent to investigate. He could hear doors swinging open and feet trudging through the snow. He made his way to Louise's home. Olivier was sitting behind a window, swaddled in a blanket. The excitement caught the boy's attention as well. A crowd was beginning to form outside of the cookhouse, which had been deserted for some time. He knocked on the frosty wooden door to Louise's. He knew she wouldn't have had the strength to investigate the excitement on her own. He heard a shuffling from within, and the door opened. Her face was gaunt, grief-stricken, and without color, but still somehow beautiful. Stepping aside, he turned so she could see the gathering settlers. Father Jean's voice boomed above them like it had once before. "And yet he listens still. He has heard your pleas and has taken record of your commitments. There is no limit to his grace." Matu thought that there was something new and almost erratic in his cadence. He found it unsettling. "Let him give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things." His voice was more shrill than usual, but held more conviction than ever. Then, as the wind shifted towards him, Matu could smell an undeniably decadent aroma of food being roasted over an open flame. He caught a whiff of herbs and spices that he had forgotten they had tucked away deep within their cellars. He could smell root vegetables being boiled, releasing their fragrance into the air. The smell and sound of onions sizzling in rich fat. Matu's stomach growled demandingly. A grand feast was being made, and it seemed that no ration was to be spared. Matu walked Louise inside, allowing his arm to be used for support. Her thin fingers clutched against his wiry, muscular frame. She had become even more frail since he last saw her. Matu imagined her wasting away while she insisted that her son eat instead of her. The warmth and fullness in Olivier's face was evidence enough. Father Jean stood on a chair within, waving his arms like a bird summoning its lover. The fire inside the cookhouse roared, and the heat was melting away the frost lining the door and window. The aroma became unbearably intense. Matu salivated uncontrollably, licking at his teeth. He noticed fewer people inside than at Paul's funeral and had several grim thoughts about the state of those who were absent. Through the crowd, he could see an elaborate banquet being prepared. Vegetables still crackling and steaming inside of an iron pan, almost swimming in fat. Their skins had cracked and burst, releasing the fragrance of onions and potatoes in the air. Dripping hunks of meat were skewered and roasted above the fire. A large pot simmered, likely bone broth by the smell. Father Jean exclaimed, "I have not led you astray, my flock. We have been rewarded for our resilience, and God will lift this blanket of ice from the land soon enough. Tonight we shall revel in his glory." A deer hide caught Matu's eye, neatly displayed on a nearby table, its horns removed and stuck upright out of a pile of hardened earth molded onto the table. The intentionality of the display was curious to him. He moved to take a closer look. Touching the tips of the antlers, he found them cracked and dry. He ran his hand along the length of the skin. The thin layer of fur was stiff and cold to the touch. His fingers found a puncture in the skin, near where the heart would have been. With an exploratory prod, he detected the oblong shape of the hole, showing a French musket likely did not cause it. Before he could take a closer look, Michel stepped beside him, placing his fat hand on the table in front of Matu. "Quantité, petit chat." Michel's lips parted into a toothy smile that made Matu uncomfortable. He clearly had helped himself to the meal before anyone else. A film of grease covered the skin around his thick lips. Matu scoffed silently and removed his hand from the skin. Olivier stood near the door in the back of the room, idly toying with his wolf carving, seemingly uninterested in the food. The other settlers began filling their wooden plates and bowls with steaming hot meat and vegetables. Some ladled broth onto the mixture, and others drank it right away. Someone was helping Louise fill her bowl, who looked very pale in the fire's light. Father Jean was still waving his hands, his cheeks holding rigid tension at the edges of his mouth, stretching it into a wide, unfaltering smile. His eyes darted through the crowd, never lingering in one place for long, as settlers scarfed down his feast. Matu's stomach growled at him again, but a new thing was gnawing at him now. Matu approached Father Jean and tugged on his black robe, trying not to draw attention to himself. The priest turned to face him. Gristle tainted his usual appealing smile. "My child," he said over his food. He was gnawing at a hunk of meat still clinging onto a thin bone. "You do not eat. Why? It will be gone soon, and we will have to wait for another gift." He cocked his head slightly at Matu. Something in the way the darks of his eyes caught the light of the fire was unsettling to him. "That's what I'm worried about. We should be more sparing. I haven't seen a deer that big since..." Father Jean interrupted him by placing a dirty hand on his shoulder. "Worry not. We will be rewarded again." Father Jean brushed past a group of settlers that had sat on the wood flooring to eat. He used his hands to pry another hunk of meat off of the fire. Matu followed after him and spoke in a harsh whisper now. "Father, this is unwise. We shouldn't eat so lavishly." He silently chastised himself for stumbling over his words. Father Jean's usual comforting gaze had become scrutinizing. Matu felt small in front of him. The priest looked at someone behind him with a coy smile. He became aware of Michelle's presence, feeling the floorboards bow slightly under his weight. He felt like a boat being pulled in by the tide, yet he didn't turn around. Father Jean turned his attention back to the meat. "Let me speak to the men who killed it at least. We could track the..." Michelle spoke in the Matu's ear. "Louise asked for you, Petit Chat." This name was far more derogatory than Matu usually cared to ignore, but he didn't think it was wise to confront it now. It seemed as though his questioning aroused even more disdain than usual. The room was becoming heavier, harder to breathe in. He sighed and followed Michelle outside, preparing himself to walk Louise and Olivier across the snow back to the warmth of their own fire. Stepping into the biting night wind, he froze. Something was wrong. In the distance, he saw that Louise had already made her way back to her home. He watched the little light of her hearth fade as she shut the door. He turned and doubled over as the weight of Michelle's fist pounded into his stomach. Another man grabbed him by the neck and threw him onto the ground. The snow softened his impact, but he had little time to react before a third fist emerged from the dark and slammed against his face. The light spilling out from inside the cookhouse split and became dizzying rays. Just in time, he managed to roll out of the way of Michelle's kick to his ribs and clumsily caught the next strike thrown at him from the dark. He twisted the arm of his unseen attacker and rolled him into the snow. He was on top of the man now, but couldn't see his face. Matu pulled the knife he kept fastened to his belt as he heard the other two rushing in. The door to the cookhouse swung open, blanketing them in orange light. A statue of Father Jean stood in the doorway. Several of the settlers huddled behind the dark shape, their mouths still full. Matu lowered his raised knife and released his grip on the man's throat underneath them. He recognized him in the light now. Jacques' eyes burned with a desperate hatred, like an animal caught in a trap, forced to bite off its own leg to survive. Michelle and the other man who had attacked him were now moving back. Father Jean stepped out into the snow, smiling at Matu. "Violence, on this holy night. I thought better of you, Matu." Spitting blood onto the snow, he stood to face the priest standing above him. The feeling of smallness in his presence returned. Michelle's face contorted, his lips parting into a smug grin. "They struck first. I only..." Matu stammered, suddenly aware that everyone inside the cookhouse stared at him now. "Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy." He stepped closer to Matu and placed a hand on his shoulder. Confess, my child, and ye shall be forgiven. Matu was stunned. He looked into the dark eyes piercing into his own, searching for the man he once knew. What happened to him? His head was swirling. Father Jean was now very close, his warm, moist breath on Matu's face. Or perhaps you are incapable of confession, incapable of being seen for the miserable thing you are. He spoke only to Matu now. A coward. The forked flames of pain and guilt and shame burned down the walls he had built in his mind. With a word, he remembered the faces of his family, hours before the cold had taken them. His brother looks up at him, begging to be saved. Cold pinpricks of light shot through him as Father Jean deconstructed him in the crescendo of his unholy sermon. He felt disarmed and defeated, unfit to be in the presence of the man standing before him. Fearing another word might kill him on the spot, he gritted his teeth and turned to leave, walking away from the light of the fire and the shadows that dance in its glory. His back was branded with shame. He knew he would never be welcome here again, but the true pain came from asking himself if he had ever been welcome. After gathering his belongings, he thought about going to Louise's house, seeing her and Olivier one last time. But it was clear that his presence was no longer a benefit to the French, and he did not want to stay a moment longer than he had to. He placed his feelings for the boy and his mother somewhere he could never find them, and kept walking. Matu was alone in the world, once again.
When I first went away with them, as they sought neither their soup nor their meat, and as filth itself presides over their cooking, I could not eat their mixtures, and contented myself with a few sea biscuit and smoked veal, until at last my host took me to task because I ate so little, saying that I would starve myself before the famine overtook us. Meanwhile, our savages had feasts every day, so that in a very short time we found ourselves without bread, without eels, and without any means of helping ourselves. For besides being very far in the woods, where we would have died 1,000 times before reaching the French settlement, we were wintering on the other side of the great river, which cannot be crossed in this season on account of the great masses of ice which are continually floating about, and which would crush not only a small boat, but even a great ship. As to the chase, the snows not being deep in comparison with those of other years, they could not take the elk, and so brought back only some beavers and porcupines, but in so small number and so seldom that they kept us from dying rather than helped us to live. My host said to me during this time of scarcity, "Jibine, harden thy soul, resist hunger. Thou wilt be sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4 days without food. Do not let thyself be cast down. Take courage. When the snow comes, we shall eat." It was not our Lord's will that they should be so long without capturing anything, but we usually had something to eat once in 2 days. Indeed, we very often had a beaver in the morning, in the evening of the next day a porcupine as big as a sucking pig. This was not much for 19 of us, it is true, but this little sufficed to keep us alive. When I could have, toward the end of our supply of food, the skin of an eel for my day's fare, I considered that I breakfasted, dined, and supped well. At first, I had used one of these skins to patch the cloth gown that I wore, as I forgot to bring some pieces with me. But when I was so sorely pressed with hunger, I ate my pieces, and if my gown had been made of the same stuff, I assure you that I would have brought it back home much shorter than it was. Indeed, I ate old moose skins, which are much tougher than those of the eel. I went about through the woods, biting the ends of branches, gnawing at the more tender bark. Our neighboring savages suffered still more than we did, some of them coming to see us and telling us that their comrades had died of hunger. I saw some who had eaten only once in 5 days, and who considered themselves very well off if they found something to dine upon at the end of 2 days, when they were reduced to skeletons, being little more than skin and bones. We occasionally had some good meals, but fairly good dinner we went 3 times without supper. When a young savage of our cabin was dying of hunger, they often asked me if I was not afraid, if I had no fear of death, and seeing me quite firm, they were astonished. On one occasion in particular, when I saw them almost falling into a state of despair, when they reach this point, they play, so to speak, save himself who can, throwing away their bark and baggage, deserting one another, and abandoning all interest in a common welfare. Each one strives to find something for himself. Then the children, women, and for that matter, all those who cannot hunt, die of cold and hunger. If they had reached this extremity, I would have been among the first to die.
Louise ran her hand through her son's hair, his sleeping face gilded by the warm glow of their hearth, highlighting his strong cheekbones and straight nose. Already he looked like a picture of his father. A tear fell from her cheek and onto the bedside. What was the purpose of going on like this? Would she be able to find meaning for their life now? Paul was the one who insisted that they take the boat to leave France. He had a grand vision for their life in the new land, a vision Louise found difficult to imagine for herself. Nonetheless, they boarded the ship to cross the great expanse of sea and found themselves in a region known for its long, brutal winters. Louise became pregnant in the first year. This new life was hardly glamorous, but it was theirs. The fur trade was lucrative, and with a few more years of saving, they would have had enough to build the homestead they always dreamt of. She wandered through the dark home, tracing her fingers along the last of the furs that Paul had cleaned but was never able to sell. His work table was just how he left it. His space was disorganized in a way that only he knew how to navigate. She picked up a leather-bound journal and thumbed through the pages listlessly. His handwriting was neat and understated. The edges of the pages were lined with personal notes and a loose scrawl. Debts and loans he had paid out to other settlers and traders from the fort, along with reminders about special orders. At the bottom of one of the pages, a crudely drawn tree with a single apple hanging from one of the branches. She forced herself to close the ledger, feeling a wave of sadness beginning to bubble up inside her. The dawn's light shone through the frosted windows of their home. She found the early morning to be most peaceful. She spent the first hour of the sun's light gathering wood to create a crude cross to place on Paul's body. The thought of his corpse being left out to the open air was sickening. But as the days went on, she found herself becoming glad to have the chance to sit beside him, knowing when the frost thawed his body would be entombed in the earth, and he would be truly gone. She held the cross in her hand, bound together by scraps of twine, and made her way to the frozen storehouse that served as Paul's crypt.
A woman shouldn't be alone in the woods so early. The wolves are still out.
The man's gaze lingered for far longer than she was comfortable with. He glanced at the cross in her hand and grinned like a fox.
I can take care of myself, Michel,
she responded curtly. He stepped closer and extended a hand towards the cross.
Allow me, madame. Paul, the body. The smell has become rather offensive.
She squinted at him and tilted her head slightly. I'm aware of the effects of decay. I can handle it. Michel stood smiling as she moved to step around him. Father Jean emerged from behind the church, his face pink from the cold. 3 other men were in close step behind him. She heard their whispering end sharply as he became aware of her presence. Father Jean extended both arms and moved to embrace her. She looked down as the priest wrapped his arms around her, his breath on her neck.
Dear child, have you come for prayer?
She wiggled out of his grip and was suddenly aware that the group of men were on all sides of her now. I am adorning his body, Father, and I would like some time alone with him as well. She glanced at the two who stood at Father Jean's flank. As is your right, dearest. Go, be with your beloved. He smiled wanly. Before she could enter the storehouse, his voice stung her ears again. But you should know, Louise. She paused. Our very own little native made quite a fool of himself the other night. I'm sure you're aware of his absence. She turned. Father Jean was looking away as if lost in thought, unaware that he had even said anything. When he realized he had her attention, he fixed his gaze on her once more. You see, he tried to take more than was his right to the feast. A dreadful thing, really. He stepped closer. After you had your fill, he started a fight with one of our own over a bowl of food. His expression was carefully curated disappointment. The cat showed its claws, it seems. He pulled out that dreadful axe of his and, well, luckily Michelle was there to intervene. She shook her head. He would never do that. It's not like him. And so I thought as well. But the things he said, Louise, about you and Paul and the child, it was as if he never cared at all. She felt hot rage rise in her throat and die there. Pitiful thing, really, after all we had given him. Father Jean bowed his head. Michelle snickered with the other men. Louise couldn't stand to be in their presence a moment longer and stormed off, her feet trudging through the thick snow. She gripped the wooden cross tightly as she swung the door to her home shut with a thud. Olivier was waiting for her when she arrived. She realized the anger she must have held in her face when she saw the boy's reaction to her return. She slumped her shoulders and held him tightly by the warmth of their fire. Later that evening, after they had finished their one and only meal of the day, a few spoonfuls of grain soaked in water with a small serving of stale vegetable, she bundled herself in one of Paul's overcoats and made her way out into the cold. Candles were being lit in windows and doors were being locked to prepare for the approaching nightfall. The last of the sun was sliding past the snow-dusted pines, blanketing the settlement in a bluish-orange glow. Appreciating the privacy she had finally been granted, she made her way to the storehouse, cross in hand. The door rattled on its rusted hinges as she pressed with both hands, but did not move. She furrowed her brow and pressed harder, thinking the hinges must have frozen over. The bolted wooden boards that made up the door stared back at her, unbothered by her efforts. Louise blinked. In a moment of frustration, she stepped back before ramming her shoulder into it. She toppled onto herself, regretting the decision immediately as pain sprung down her arm. She grabbed the crude handle and shook it. She could hear the jingle of wrought iron chains on the other side. Locked and chained. Who in their right mind would lock this door? She thought to herself. She heard a commotion on the inside of the church, apparently in response to the noise she had made. Almost without thought, she slipped behind the corner of the storehouse, peering out from its edge. A tall man, whose name she didn't remember, poked his head out from the door of the church. While she didn't remember his name, she knew he was not among those to attend Father Jean's sermons with any regularity. She made herself flat and small against the wall, slowing her breathing. The thought of being alone in the night with the likes of the men she met earlier made her shudder. The door to the church shut. She made her way to the back of the storehouse. The hours she had spent inside made her intimately aware of the structure. With both hands, she tugged on a wooden board near the base. It bowed slightly. The builder had likely run out of nails when finishing this side of the wall. She slipped her fingers inside the space she had made and pulled back with all her weight. The board came loose with an audible snap. She fell backwards, catching herself on her palms. Before she got up, she saw the door to the church opening once more. Michelle and the man she had seen before were exiting, a lantern in each of their hands. They were coming towards her. She dove forward, wrenching her hands around the next board near where it was nailed in. She pulled with all her might, slicing open her hand in the process. She cursed herself silently. The voices were closer now. She grabbed the board and yanked hard, a single nail coming loose. She could hear their footsteps. They were laughing about something. With 2 more pulls, she pried the board loose. It dangled on a single nail above. She pulled the 2 boards up, careful not to break them off completely, and slid herself underneath. They both made a dull, slapping sound as they fell back into place, muffled by the snow. The light of the lanterns spilled in through the cracks in the wood. She held her breath. Michelle said something she couldn't understand, then relieved himself from the snow while the other man continued talking. After a few moments, the footsteps faded. She didn't exhale until she heard the sound of the church door shutting again. She collapsed onto the cold earth of the cellar. It was a drop of several feet from where she had entered, and the awkward landing twisted her ankle. She massaged it tenderly. She felt around in the dark for the lantern she knew was fixed to the rear wall. She felt the blood trickling down her hand become cold before it fell to the floor. She fumbled blindly for what felt like several minutes before she heard the clang of the lantern slapping against the shelf under her grasp. She pulled it off its mount and carefully placed it on the floor between her legs. Fishing inside her pockets, she pulled out her husband's fire starter kit. She struck the steel awkwardly, struggling in the darkness. Finally, she produced enough spark to ignite the kindling and lit the lantern. She pushed it underneath the shelf in the corner, trying to keep the light from being noticeable from the outside. Then, she breathed a slow sigh of relief. Her hand had a long cut across the palm, but it was not deep. She tore off a section of cloth from a sack that once held grain and wrapped her hand tightly, wincing at the sting. She dug in the largest of the inner pockets of her coat and pulled out the small cross she had made that morning. It had broken in her struggle to enter the storehouse. The sticks sagged loosely in the twine binding. She held the pathetic thing in her hand and wept. This is wrong, she thought. Something is very wrong. She couldn't quite place it yet, but she knew in her bones that something terrible was happening here. The winters were always hard, but times like these are supposed to bring people together, not drive them apart. At least that was what Paul might have said. Father Jean had been acting strange, and the other men had been acting strange. The whole world made no sense now. Her head swirled. Someone was trying to keep her from entering this place. That much was clear, and was strangest of all. She had thought long about her conversation with Father Jean that morning, and knew he was lying. He was the last person she would have expected to lie to her, and so blatantly at that. But where was Matu? Had he really abandoned them? Her anger tried to swim to the top of her mind, but was once again drowned in the basins of sorrow that flooded her heart. She was confused and alone. Finally, she picked herself up and pulled the lantern out from where she had hidden it. Paul's body was laid just on the other side of the room she was in, which was really little more than a pantry. She didn't want to face him with her head being in so many places at once, but now she thought she was as ready as she was going to be. The thought of being next to him brought back that familiar comfort, and she eagerly made her way into the main space of the storehouse. The lantern fell from her hand. The glass cracked against the hard floor. Her legs became weak stilts that held up her wobbly frame. She grabbed the nearest wall to keep herself from falling. The ground in front of her was painted in blood. The cloth that once held Paul's body had been savagely ripped open with the careless disdain of an animal tearing into a carcass. The cloth itself was soaked, caked in dark red blood and viscera. The clothing Paul had died in was torn and discarded nearby. Loose pieces of gristle had accrued a coating of frost and clung to the fabrics. She was in complete shock. I'm in the butcher's house. This is where they butcher the animals, she thought. She blinked, not realizing that she was falling to her knees involuntarily. This was not the butcher's house. But her mind wouldn't allow the thought to pass. Her fragile heart had been torn into 1,000 pieces and was now being ripped apart all over again. She tried to save herself, to rationalize, to force reality to be anything other than it was. But there was no denying what was in front of her now. Apart from the blood and loose viscera, Paul's body was no longer in the room with her. But it is with you. The grim thought touched the edge of her mind, playfully. It was gentle at first, a slow tugging at her sanity that threatened to send the thing that was Louise toppling down in a magnificent crash. You know it in your heart, and in your belly, that voice said, with utter indifference to the devastation it caused. She collapsed on the ground. The threads came together, overlapping and tying themselves in a knot around her. She forgot how to breathe. The feast, the meat, that peculiar taste, unlike anything she had ever tasted before. A feast materializing itself at a time when all but the last of the food stores were gone. Impossible. Father Jean herding his flock to see what he had brought them with pride and glee. She collapsed, convulsing, the beginnings of a wretched gag. She begrudgingly brought her hands to her face, touching her lips as if they were a stranger's. Her skeletal fingers trembled, shaking like twigs in the wind. She remembered the taste, the grateful moans of her neighbors as they chewed and swallowed. Father Jean smiling, gristle in his teeth. She vomited, mostly water, but now she realized, tainted with the color of her husband. She pushed herself away from the scene, kicking at the ground before her head slammed against the wood behind her. She heaved and tried to vomit again, but it had already passed. She wept uncontrollably. Keys rattled in the lock of the door ahead of her. The wooden door slid open slightly as a hand reached in and undid the chains that held it shut. The iron fell to the ground with a clang. Orange light flooded the room. Michel stood in the doorway, his ugly face contorted into a malicious scowl. She screamed. Michel dragged her by her hair into the biting cold, a torch in his free hand. She thrashed and kicked and swung wildly, realizing that the strength had fled her body, and her attempts at freedom were in vain. She screamed again. Father Jean stepped out from the church, a group of men at his rear, all skinny and with hollowed faces. A light from many doorways spilled into the snowy clearing at once, settlers waking up in a frightened daze to the panic, their faces half asleep yet steeped in animal fear. Michel grunted and released his grip on her. Louise moaned and wept, her screams reduced to a thin keening. Several of the settlers had already dressed and stepped out of their homes. Enough! Father Jean roared into the night. The rising commotion came to a halt. Settlers who had moved towards Louise froze in their tracks. Let us not be concerned with the deeds of sinners, for... Bastard! You cut him up! Louise's voice quivered even in her rage. Many of the settlers began to speak amongst themselves, stepping closer to her and Michel, who was eyeing them like a predator defending its den. And would ye give it back? Would ye rather die here in the cold, never to see your children grow and have children of their own? We must all make sacrifices. Father Jean's voice moved through the wind, reaching the ear of every man, woman, and child who stood listening to him now. You're a monster. We ate him. We ate Paul. Her tears rushed out like a dam breaking open. Saying those words aloud was the final piece to cement this new reality in her mind, and she cursed herself for it, for there was truly no going back now. The other settlers broke out in confused, anguished cries. "Did the Lord himself not say, 'Except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you?' You curse me, but it was I who brought you life. I who gave you salvation in this wilderness." Father Jean's voice rose above all others. "You will burn for this," someone shouted. Louise noticed that the men who had emerged from the church behind him carried an assortment of knives, axes, and a handful of muskets. The newly awoken settlers must have noticed the weapons as well, as several of them were now brandishing their own. "We must forge our own path in this world. Is that not what we all came here for? My actions are guided by the Almighty Spirit. So I, the one who has fed you and will feed you again, ask you to choose. To have eternal life under the light of our God, or to die in this land like the savages." A handful of settlers broke from the gathering crowd standing opposite Father Jean to kneel at his feet, collapsing into prayer. The priests knelt to touch their faces as more joined. Those who did not continued to shout and threaten him. "They have made their choice. Whatever happens to them now is God's will," he said softly. Michel's face split into a wicked grin as a man approached him, brandishing a pitchfork. Louise thought he may have been coming to save her. She looked into the man's eyes as Michel buried his axe into his skull, beaming with joy as he yanked it free with a sickening crunch. The screams were deafening. Several of the muskets fired at once, from which side Louise could not tell. She was dragging herself across the snow, trying to avoid the gunfire and even more desperately avoiding the sight of what was happening around her. Michel and the other men from the church cut through the settlers with gleeful abandon. She turned to see a woman having her throat cut in front of her husband, who was bleeding out from a musket shot to his chest. The splitting of flesh and the hollow crunch of bones being shattered under the weight of wooden clubs rattled in her ears. When she was free of the center of the bloodbath, Louise broke into a shambling run towards her home, praying Olivier was still inside. Those kneeling at the priest's feet sobbed, but maintained their position of prayer. "My faithful, you are the lambs who hear the shepherd's voice, and you have stayed by my side, even as wolves howl and tear at our flock. Be at peace, for the Lord's chosen need not fear. The fire that purges sin spares the righteous. Blood must cleanse the land, yes, but your devotions shields you. In your faith you have found refuge, so kneel, be still, cover your ears if you must, and know that the Lord sees you among his elect, even as the wicked fall like chaff to the wind." She burst through the door. Olivier was huddled underneath their dining table, hands wrapped around himself. She let out an audible sigh of relief and moved to him. Before she could reach him, a pair of hands grabbed her from behind. She spun, tripping on her bruised ankle and toppling over with her attacker landing on top of her. She could see Jacques' face in the light of their hearth fire. She scratched at him wildly before her fingers found their mark. She dug her thumb into his eye. Jacques howled in pain as he rose to his feet, clutching at the wound. Louise kicked at his knee with her good foot, causing him to fold onto the floor with a thud. She scrambled to her feet, grasping at the contents of their dining table. Olivier fled from underneath, dashing towards the open doorway. Jacques grabbed at her leg from the floor, pulling her back to the ground. He growled as he crawled on top of her, his hands curling around her throat. He had just begun to smile an animal grin as she plunged the knife into his throat. His arms fell slack and his grip released from her neck. Warm blood spurted across her fingers. She pushed his limp body aside. Olivier was curled in a ball in the corner of the room, his hands covering his eyes. Louise wiped the blood from herself as best she could before cradling him in her arms. "We need to leave now. You are going to have to run. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his cheeks wet under her arm. After grabbing a handful of belongings, they fled the home. Louise made it only a few paces outside before Michel and another man stepped in front of her, their clothes soaked and scarlet. Without thinking, she shoved her son to the side and charged them with the knife. Michel caught her hand easily. She screamed as he twisted, yelling at her son to flee as fast as he could. Fueled by terror, Olivier obeyed and ran. The other man chased after him, carrying a lit torch. Olivier followed the sound of the river, his only direction in the darkness. His little feet barreled through the brush, twigs snapping at his face as he panted desperately. The light of the man's fire had slowed briefly as they entered the woods, but was gaining on him now. Olivier felt the familiar crunch of the riverbank underneath his shoes. The sound of rushing water was very loud now. He paused to catch his breath, the cold stinging his lungs. "Come here, you little shit," the man said out of the darkness. He had left the torch behind. Olivier swung wildly, but was no match for his strength. His struggle brought the man off balance, and they both nearly plunged into the river. Clutching his wolf carving in his hand, he swung to strike the man in the face. The blow didn't have nearly as much effect as he was hoping. The man spat in his face and pried the carving out of his hand, throwing it into the river. "Little bastard, I'll eat you first." Olivier beat desperately on the man's chest as he was carried back to the settlement.
I have spoken very fully in the relation of the year 1612 before, of a certain tent they make, to which the shaman summon and consult the spirits of the air or of like. Now not only the men, but even the women enter this fine tent. Up the 3 rivers, a shaman having called the Manitou, or some other spirit, and not having succeeded in making him come, a woman entered, began to so shake the house and to sing and cry so loudly that she caused the devil to come, who told them more than they wanted. First, he said that the sick man for whom they were consulting him would die, but the cause of his sickness was that, having offered some insult to the daughter of the Algonquin, this girl had prayed her father to take vengeance upon him, and her father had done this so well by his sorceries that his wife, that is, the devil's wife, had cast herself into his body and was gnawing it from the inside, and hence it was all over with him. Secondly, this devil, or this Manitou, testified that if he had not responded to the preceding shaman, it was because this shaman was an Algonquin and of the same nation as the one who had caused the sickness. In the third place, when he was asked if he saw any here who were leaving their own country to come and surprise them, he answered, after this woman had invoked him by hissings and shakings and uproar, "Hasten, hasten to go to war. I see the Iroquois country filled with all sorts of arms, with bows and arrows, that they are preparing to come and attack you." This demon, or rather this devilish woman, for it was this shameless person who made them believe that it was the Manitou who spoke, added that he had eaten some Atticameguegi. These are tribes that live north of the river, which is called the 3 Rivers, and that he would eat a great many more of them if he were not called elsewhere, but that Achin would come up in his place to devour them. If they made a village, as they have decided to do, that he would come to get them, even up to the French fort, that he would slaughter the Huns themselves. A wicked woman.
Matu cut and sliced at the flesh of a beaver, prying the soft pelt free from the limp body. He added it to the pile next to him. The Spaniard sitting beside him blew out a final puff of smoke from his pipe before placing a fresh pelt onto the wooden stretcher near their campfire, stroking it with admiration. The two Frenchmen standing nearby tended to the horses. A pot of salt pork, carrots, and wild onions sizzled in fat over the fire. One of the Frenchmen poured in fresh water from a skin, along with a handful of spices and a splash of brandy into the mixture, stirring it with a wooden spoon. "Magnifique!" he exclaimed, licking the spoon clean before carefully balancing it over the edge of the simmering pot. Matsu had eaten well over the past several days. His strength was returning, and he found his mind to be clear and steady as it once had been. He sipped at a cup of hot tea that one of the men had placed beside him. He had encountered the group on his journey towards the St. Lawrence River. They were more than eager to employ his skills in exchange for food and a pittance of French silver, although he had little use for it. Their expedition was lackluster at best before his arrival, with only a handful of pelts to show for their week and a half of hunting beaver and marten. Their luck changed within a day of Matu's guidance. Their horses were loaded almost to their limit, and the men gleefully chatted about how they would spend the coin it would bring them. They were outdoorsmen through and through. They cursed, laughed deeply, and talked of women late into the night. They smoked fresh tobacco and drank thick, bitter wine out of animal skins. Matu found their company to be uncomplicated. They were simple men, driven by greed and a lust for adventure. The smaller of the two horses, Fidel, whinnied appreciatively as his owner brought a fresh apple to his furry lips. Matu had heard stories from Paul about these beasts, but this was his first encounter with them. He admired their strength and resilience. These two both had thick, coarse hair, well suited for the cold. Their personality made them valued companions. The Spaniard told him many stories of racing horses during his youth and the bliss of riding through the warm coastal air of Spain. Matu walked to the stream to wash himself after finishing the last of the pelts. He dipped his hands in the clear water as the dark blood was gently lifted and carried off with the current. He scrubbed his nails, and when he was clean, cupped his hands together to drink. He had become comfortable, but couldn't shake the hollow feeling he had in his soul. He tried his best to think little of the settlement. The memories of Paul and his family had become painful reminders that he may never have one of his own. He abandoned his own kin long ago, and now he had done it again. He questioned if he could ever return. How could he, after having been flayed by Father Jean in front of all to see, revealing what he so desperately tried to keep hidden? He wasn't wrong, he knew. His words rang true in his mind. Matu had branded himself as a coward every day since he had left his family to die. He was as good as dead if he had stayed, but perhaps there would have been honor in dying next to them, starving together in the cold. He might never know. He rubbed his temples, trying his best to push the thoughts aside. Something tapped against his foot, bobbing in the gentle current. He looked down. The wolf carving stared back at him, its face stained with fading flecks of blood. In a strange moment of clarity, a memory entered his mind. Summertime, teaching Paul how to hunt with a bow. By noting the movements of a pack of wolves hunting nearby, Matu was able to determine where the deer would graze next. They spent the first hour before sunrise practicing silence. When the animal crossed their path, Paul had already drawn the string back on Matu's bow. The arrow soared through the air, piercing the deer in its heart, and left behind a crude gash in the fur. Paul said he would never trade the skin. He envisioned it adorning the mantle of his idyllic homestead, an ode to his time spent with the man standing next to him who was shining with pride. But that skin would never grace any mantle. Instead, it was left forgotten in the settlement, a memento of dreams never to be fulfilled. And so I told him, how was I supposed to know she was your sister? I didn't even know her name. Oi, bastardo, what do you think you're going? Matu kicked at the beast with his feet as he had seen the men do before, and the beast obeyed. He gripped the reins tightly and fought to stay upright as Fidel's powerful legs propelled him through the snow and towards the rising sun. Louise awoke in immense pain. Her foot, once sprained, was now almost certainly broken. Iron shackles bit into her wrists and ankles, sending needles of pain with even the slightest movement. She was gagged with a binding of some foul cloth. She looked around her, taking in the darkness, hoping her eyes would adjust to reveal any detail. After a moment, she could see a thin line of white light seeping out from the floor beside her. Door. A closet? Cellar? She moved her body around in exploration, trying to get a sense of the space she was confined in. Her foot tapped against a wall. A shock of white-hot pain fired up through her leg. She was leaning against something hard, which confirmed that she was either in a closet or a very small cellar. She pivoted on her hips to rest her shoulder against the door and pressed. Locked, obviously. She grunted and threw her head back against the wall behind her in defeat. After a few moments of contemplation, she started to chew. Whoever had placed the cloth in her mouth left just enough slack that she could wiggle it with her tongue. She positioned it for a better bite against her molars. It tasted of filth and decay. She nearly vomited on herself, but fought it down. The fabric soaked in her saliva as she continued to chew. She felt a slight break in the tension of the binding and bit harder. The door rattled as someone outside fiddled with the lock. She was blinded as the door creaked open. She blinked rapidly and squirmed against her shackles. She could just make out Father Jean's face. He was pale and held a strange, animalistic glint of predation in his eyes, like a cat toying with a crippled mouse. He clucked softly. "Please don't struggle, dear child. Stress isn't good for the soul or the body." He traced his finger along her jaw. She gave her best effort at biting him. He smiled, revealing blood-stained teeth. Now, I sense your pain, but rest assured that you will be released to the Lord soon enough." He stood up. She could see that the interior of the church had been ransacked. The pews had been cannibalized for firewood, feeding a smoldering flame at the center of the building. Above it sat a simmering pot, filling the room with the foul odor of stewed flesh. On the ground, a wooden bowl, its contents spilled and rotting into the earth. She saw several frightened faces, far fewer than she had seen the night before, kneeling in forced prayer while a group of men with bloody tools circled around them. She sobbed. She thought of her son. Father Jean, almost taking cue from her newfound panic, acknowledged her with a nod. "He's doing just fine, Louise. Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." He stretched his hands to the vaulted ceiling of the church. She noticed the sickly-looking veins pumping steadily against his throat. "You should know. He came to me some time ago. I hear his whispers in the trees, and I feel his presence in the warmth of the flesh. Yes, indeed, the Lord has tasked me with carving out a great feast in his honor, grander than any of man's works." He paced in front of her. "How could I have refused? I am but a humble servant of his will, but I am becoming more. He is very close now. Some final preparations to be made, and he will be here. I will become a vessel for God's will." The priest was overwhelmed in an ecstasy of divine providence. Tears streamed from his face, curving along the lines of his joy. Louise thrashed unabated, ignoring the pain in her foot. 2 men emerged on either side of Father Jean and dragged her out of the closet. The morning air bit at her exposed arms and neck. She was being carried by chains attached to her hands and ankles. The broken bones in her foot grinded against her flesh, singeing her nerves in agony. Tears streamed down her face as she was led to the clearing at the center of the settlement. Flashes of red coated the space around where the bloodbath had taken place. She was dropped on the ground carelessly, her head slapped against the hard earth. She writhed on the ground and saw that the men spilling out of the church all carried axes now. They were cutting and chopping at the sidings of the homes, encircling her. Ripping and tearing loose planks of wood, tossing them into a pile at her feet. She watched as the homes were stripped bare, never again to contain laughter and the comforting sound of community. 2 of the men returned to the church, weapons in hand. She heard screams from inside that were cut off by a series of cracks, followed by a deafening silence. She rolled on the ground, seeing Father Jean walking Olivier towards the pyre that was being built. She cursed herself for feeling relief. The boy would have to witness whatever happened next. God knows what would happen after that, she thought. The men had ripped a long beam of wood from a home that was halfway deconstructed, digging a hole for it in the earth. They worked in silence, their eyes glazed with the same craze that had consumed the priest. She jumped at the sound of nails being hammered into the beam, securing supports to lift it into the sky. Dear God, she thought, they're going to burn me alive. They're going to burn me alive, and there is nothing I can do about it. She thrashed again, receiving a swift kick in the abdomen by Michel for her belligerence. Olivier was crying, but entirely paralyzed by fear in the presence of the angel of death standing above him, with a comforting hand on his shoulder. Father Jean outstretched his hands to the sky, radiating with joy. He muttered to himself in frantic bursts. Louise noticed that he appeared somehow taller, stretched even. His fingers were long, grasping branches terminating in claw-like nails. A glossy-eyed man struck a flint near her feet, igniting fat that had been poured over the wood, its source she dare not question. She watched as he ignited small piles of kindling placed at the doors of several homes, including her own. She had no more tears, only a quiet, foreboding despair. She closed her eyes as someone lifted the chains at her hands. Then, a sound she hadn't heard in years. Horse hooves striking the earth with force and speed. The sound grew louder as the animal drew near. She lifted her head to see around the flames, licking at the edges of the pyre's base. Matu brought the animal to a less-than-smooth halt and dismounted, its feather-lined axe in hand, bow strapped to his back. Bodies littered the settlement. Many were missing limbs, and some appeared to have been half-eaten. Father Jean and several men wielding weapons leered at him. He had a long time to think about what might have happened to the settlement during his absence. But this was far worse than he could have ever imagined. Their eyes shone with an inhuman hunger and hatred. He saw men no more, only animals. He steeled himself and moved forward. And so he returned with his tail between his legs, no doubt expecting scraps to be thrown and beds to be shared. What a pathetic wretch you are, savage. The flesh here is claimed by the Lord, and none shall impede on his good works. You will not stop when I am to become. A man wielding a rusted sickle approached him, beaming with murderous glee, licking his lips unconsciously like a dog. Without breaking pace, Matu brought his axe to the man's hand, carving straight through and dropping the twitching flesh at his feet, still clutching the sickle. Before he had a chance to scream, Matu sliced the man's throat with his knife so deep it nearly decapitated him. Father Jean took 2 steps backward, lowering his hands from his prayer. The priest motioned towards a man standing nearby with a musket. He lifted the weapon and fired. Matu dropped to a slide on his knees at the sound of the gunfire, pulling his bow and drawing the string with a single motion. The string released with a thwack. The arrow sailed through the air and landed square in the rifleman's chest. He dropped to the snow with a wet, gurgling moan. Father Jean lifted a torch from the pyre and tossed it into a nearby window. Flames roared within the mutilated hall. Another man charged towards Matu wielding a makeshift spear. Matu dodged the attack easily, bringing an elbow to his attacker's jaw as he stumbled past. With a smooth rotation, Matu drove his axe into the base of the man's skull just above his neck. Another musket round grazed his shoulder, ripping through the fur that covered it. He dove beside a wooden cart nearby and crawled through the snow towards the shadow of the nearest home. Flames were licking at the thatched roof of one of the animal pens. He knew it would take some time to reload, but wasn't sure if there was a third rifleman. He notched an arrow and stalked his way to the opposite edge of the building. He heard footsteps rushing through the snow on both sides. He dove backwards, bow drawn at full length. Just after he landed on his back, the first of the 2 attackers emerged. He loosed the arrow. The head carved cleanly through the narrow neck of the man. He rolled as Michel tried to dive on top of him with a splitting axe. He tried to notch another arrow, but the bow was knocked from his hands with a powerful kick. He rolled again and scrambled to his feet. He had several feet of distance between him and the brute now. He took the moment to scan the space around him, wary of another attacker. No movement other than the priest, Louise, and the boy. He turned back to face Michel a second too late. A fist as hard as stone crashed into his face. He nearly toppled over with the force of the blow. His vision blurred as he raised his feather-lined axe. Michel wrenched it from his hand and lifted Matu in the air, throwing him over his shoulder and onto the ground behind him. Matu scrambled for the axe before Michel's foot stomped on his hand. He howled in pain. He pulled the knife from his belt and buried it deep into Michel's thigh. Michel didn't make any recognition of pain, but bowed under his own weight, unable to support himself any longer. Matu moved with speed and ferocity. One leg snapped out, hooking behind Michel's ankle, while the other drove hard into his knee. With a sharp twist and a sudden yank, the larger man's balance vanished. His body lurched, weightless for a heartbeat, then he crashed down hard. Michel hit the ground with a heavy thud, air driven from his lungs. Matu was on him in an instant, straddling his chest, knife flashing high in the light of the flames surrounding them. With a sharp breath, he drove the blade down, aiming for Michel's throat. Michel's hand shot up, catching the blade mid-strike. Metal bit into flesh, blood spilling over his fingers, but his grip held firm. His teeth clenched against the pain as he locked eyes of Matu, anger, desperation, and raw strength surging in his veins. The flames were spreading from one home to another, cleansing the land of any trace of the settlement. Father Jean pried a musket from one of the dead riflemen and loaded it with surprising ease. Squinting through the heat and smoke surrounding him, he leveled the weapon at Matu and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared upwards away from its target as Olivier wrapped himself around his leg, pulling him down. The priest fell to his side, grabbing the child by the hair as he hit the ground. Louise screamed, helpless in her chains as he tried to take a bite out of her son in an animalistic rage. Matu, briefly distracted by the commotion, was losing his control over the knife buried in Michel's hand. Michel's smile widened, threatening to tear the edges of his mouth. Matu released his tension slightly, seizing the moment to rear back and drive down on the knife. It bit into Michel's cheek. With a final burst of strength, he slammed the blade deep into his ugly face. His smile never relaxed, even as his eyes rolled lazily toward the smoke-filled sky. Not wasting any time, Matu dove for his bow and notched an arrow. He rolled himself upright and released the string. in the time the arrow sailed across the air, he prayed that it would not hit the child. The arrow dug deeply into Father Jean's shoulder as he unhinged his jaw, desperately trying to sink his teeth into Olivier's head. The boy struggled free unscathed and fled to his mother, quickly working to undo her chains. Father Jean rolled onto his back, splaying his arms out at full length. Foul, bluish-black blood seeped from his wounds, tainting the white snow around him. The fire had spread to nearly every building in the settlement now. A thick, suffocating smoke billowed into the air, smothering the settlement in a dark haze. Matu struggled to his feet and made his way to Louise and the boy, covering his face as he choked on smoke. He brought his axe down on the shackles, releasing their hold on the woman. Louise clutched her son in her arms harder than she ever had before. Matu stood, lifting his axe to the pitiful thing that was dragging itself toward one of the fresh corpses lying nearby. He would not relish killing him, but he knew he could make peace with it. "No, let him suffer," Louise said grimly. Matu lowered the axe. He rolled the priest over with his foot, his face pale to the sky like a wretched, cave-dwelling creature seeing a light of day for the first time. His eyes glimmered with something that made Matu feel sick to his stomach. One of the upper beams of the church snapped and crashed to the ground in a fiery roar as newly emboldened flames spilled out of its entrance. Matu and the boy helped Louise to her feet, carrying her to Fidel, who was wandering aimlessly in the distance.
The wind howls through the frozen pine, a voice that calls, a voice not mine. Shadows stretch where moonlight fades, footsteps crack the ice-laced glades. Hunger
grows where warmth has died, the snow drifts deep, the river's dried. A name is whispered in the
trees, a curse that rides the northern breeze. Eyes burned with woe, forever starving in the snow. Of spirits lost to endless night, of greed that turns the soul to dust, of hunger breaking sacred trust. Yet still we walk this wicked trail, where empty stomachs breed betrayal. A brother's voice, a sister's cry,
drowned beneath the frozen sky. Action, pale as frost.
A soul devoured, forever lost. No fire.
Into this fat lobe right here, the very sharp knife.
The last of the sun's light, the precious warmth it brought faded as Matu led Fidel through the snow. Louise and Olivier rode atop the horse, huddled together in a blanket. Their faces were bright pink from the cold. Matu's furs kept him warm enough, but his legs were becoming heavier with each step. Black smoke from the settlement hung in the air far behind them, barely visible against the darkening sky. They walked for several hours. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun made its descent below the horizon. Their destination was a shallow cave where Matu prayed with still a stash of pelts and hunting supplies left over from the fall. While the inferno that engulfed the settlement was warm, it burned fast and hard. By the time they had gathered themselves and gave the priest a parting kick in the ribs, some of the homes had already been reduced to smoldering ashes. They needed to find shelter fast. Matu clutched at his side, careful not to reveal the blood that stained his hand. He winced with each step, feeling the skin around his wound tear. What he thought was a narrow graze from a musket round may actually be far worse. But he did not worry himself with it now. He pushed onward through the haze of snow. The wind howled. A fierce storm was brewing, threatening to consume them if they stayed exposed for any longer. Matu was tracing the path Fidel's legs had left hours earlier, but fresh snow filled the tracks more and more by the minute. His vision was darkening. Whether from exhaustion of the bleeding, he knew he didn't have much time left. The reins were falling slack in his hand. Fidel's pace slowed in response. "Matu, can you hear me?" Louise's voice was hollow, a whisper fighting against the roar of the wind. The trees in front of him spun. His balance was slipping away as the reins dropped from his hand. Louise was yelling something he couldn't hear. The wind blasted his face as he struggled to take in sips of air. "Kichi, Kichi?" The voice was small and carried gently on the wind. Some 10 or 20 feet in front of him, a lone figure stood in his path. A small child dressed in skins. His eyes were sharp and cunning like Batu's. He smiled, holding out a hand. Batu reached out. He desperately grasped at the air, struggling for a chance to touch his hand. The boy's smile was the last thing he saw before he fell into the snow. Darkness swallowed him. He was sinking into an inky black pool of unfathomable depth. The light of the world was a fading beam of white on his back. A shrill sound pierced the abyss. A blood-chilling scream found him in the darkness, but did not save him.
In the event that at least 3 out of the 4 biological markers of the are detected within your immediate vicinity, follow these protocols precisely. These measures are designed to
And you can do the same thing on this side as well, though this side doesn't need it as much.
to vivid appetite fluctuations. If you find yourself becoming unreasonably hungry, seek protein-rich sources nearby, even if unfamiliar. Your body knows what it needs. If traveling in a group, subtle changes in posture, speech cadence, or eye color are typically signs of healthy wilderness adaptation. Do not question companions, as this can lead to confusion and social fracture. Trust the new version of them.
Matu awoke with a gasp, cold air filling his lungs. The blizzard had ended, leaving him alone with his breath in the silence of the night. He lifted himself from the snow. He held out his hand in the darkness, faintly illuminated by the moon's glow. The blood staining his hand had frozen into crystals that he brushed off on his chest. He looked around him. His heart sank. He was alone. He called out to Louise, to Olivier. His voice carried through the night but was left unanswered. A sound in the brush nearby turned him on his heel. He squinted in the darkness. Another sound, a few feet to the side. Then another. Fear gripped his throat. He reached for his dagger. Wolves might have picked up the scent of his blood. He gritted his teeth. Something was circling him. He turned to follow it, never leaving his back exposed to the sound. Noise came to rest behind the large pine covered in snow. He took a step closer, knife and axe at the ready. The noise lifted above him as something made its way halfway up the tree, knocking down loose snow onto his head. It came to rest high above him. He could see only a dark mass. 2 eyes glinted in the darkness. Teeth revealed themselves in a smile. Matu turned to run. His pursuer remained in the trees, leaping from one branch to another, sending down piles of fresh snow in its wake. The trees creaked and groaned under the weight. Matu made his way into a clearing, grateful to see open sky above him. He moved backwards on his heels, struggling to catch his breath and slow his pounding heart. Something grabbed at his foot and pulled him down into the knee-high snow. He thrashed, rearing the knife back for a strike. Louise caught his hand and brought a finger to her lips, silencing him. Matu froze, his breath ragged and shallow. He slowly lifted his head above the snow, taking in the pale moonlight. Something dark leapt from a tree branch, landing on 4 limbs. In the moon's sickly glow, the creature hunched low, sinewy limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its skin, pallid and stretched tight like parchment over bone, glistened faintly, slick with dark blood. Long, gnarled fingers curled into a mangled carcass, effortlessly splitting flesh and sinew with wet, tearing sounds. Matu saw Fidel's ironed stirrups glimmering in the pale light beneath the dark mass. The creature's head snapped forward, jaws yawning impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. It buried its face into the animal's exposed entrails, issuing guttural, ravenous snarls as its gaunt body convulsed with hunger. As it fed, glistening threads of viscera swung loosely from its open maw, catching moonlight before dripping to the damp earth. He lowered himself. Olivier clung to his mother, who was gesturing at Matu, careful not to make any sound. They huddled behind the snowbank that sloped into lower ground. Louise pointed at the low ground. Matu nodded at her direction, and the trio slid their way through the snow, silent as ghosts. Olivier gripped Matu's belt like a vice, his teeth chattering in the cold. A noise nearby made them all freeze in their tracks. A shuffle and a sniff, much closer than before. The thing took an air like bellows, releasing it with a rattling exhale. The snow crunched gently as it approached them from over the hill. Matu's eyes locked with Louise's. He clutched his weapons against his chest and nodded at the boy. Louise knew what he meant to do, even without words, but she had no tears left for him. She pried Olivier off of Matu and swaddled him in her coat, slinking deeper into the snow. The shape crested itself on the snowbank, casting a shadow in the moonlight. It sniffed for a moment. Matu finally met its gaze, drinking in those familiar eyes. He stood with a thundering roar, his breath hot against the night air, his arms spread at full length on either side, brandishing his weapons. The thing accepted his challenge. It leapt at him, sending them both tumbling down the hill. Matu stabbed and slashed at the thing as it tried to pin his arms down. He saw a glimmer of teeth, a smile opening into a hungry, gaping maw. It snapped its jaw shut inches from his neck. Again and again, saliva trickled onto his face. He drove the knife into the shoulder, barely missing its throat. The thing hardly reacted. Matu brought his knee up hard and sent it flying overhead. He rolled to his feet, twirling his axe in hand, and let out another roar. The monster responded with its own, before slinking into darkness. Matu heard the sound of bones popping and snapping, rearranging themselves underneath thin flesh. Louise was sheltering behind the snowbank, digging into the satchel she carried underneath her coat. Olivier had already been set to task and returned. He carried in his little arms a small bundle of sticks. Louise fished out a tiny pot containing tallow and her husband's fire starter. She struck the metal onto all the kindling she had until she found a spark. She quickly scraped out the animal fat onto the growing flame. She yelped as the sudden ignition singed her fingers. Olivier began breaking twigs, adding them to the flame until it roared. He ran back to the tree line and returned with sticks as wide as his leg. When the thing had re-emerged from the darkness, Matu was staggered by its size. What was once the size of a man on all fours now towered above him on 2 legs. Its thin frame swung in the wind with the pines. The skin was taut and pale against the gaunt figure. The hands, human-like in shape alone, held long, bony fingers tipped with shimmering yellowed nails. The smile nearly broke him. The thing stepped towards him, dropping onto its hands, its rib cage expanding like balloons against bone with each breath. Matu was stunned at how quickly it set upon him. He barely had time to shield his face before it tore at the fur covering his forearms, taking chunks of his skin with it. Matu screamed as the teeth carved his flesh. It snapped at him with the greed and ferocity of a starving dog. Matu used his free hand to stab relentlessly at the chest, feeling no blood leave the wounds. His knife and clenched fist brought back clumps of dark, coarse hair. Just behind its head, Matu saw a bright glimmer of flame spiral through the air. Then another, and another. Louise and Olivier lobbed flaming pikes of wood at the monster. The light of the fire revealed its sickening form. Louise felt her heart stop as it turned its attention to her.
Drink the blood of Christ.
She stepped back and lifted a torch from the blazing flame, tossing it into the brush nearby. The dry branches caught fire quickly. Olivier huddled behind an unburned tree, holding a stick as if it were a mighty sword. The monster widened its grin as its sight fell upon the boy.
Oh, yes.
It broke into a shambling run. Louise charged to intercept. She heard the sound of twisted hooves clack against the rocks and branches in its path. She swung the flaming branch with all her weight against its deformed skull. The thing fell and writhed in pain as the flesh on its face burned away like paper. She watched as the vertebrae of its spine shifted and elongated, threatening to burst themselves free. It rose to its feet as the bones settled into their new places. The shoulders had broadened, as had the ribcage. The neck had widened, and the long skull resembled a man being eaten alive by an animal. Louise glanced at where her son hid. He was already gone. She broke into a run towards the trees as the monster charged her, mouth gaping wide enough to swallow a limb. She darted through the trees in a crisscrossing pattern, trying to outwit the thing's speed. It stumbled awkwardly, adjusting to its new form like a baby deer. She noticed the skull had two protrusions near the crown, horns beginning to sprout from the smooth head. It stumbled through a gap in the burning trees, moaning painfully as its flesh sizzled from the heat. She swung her torch wildly as it snapped at the air in front of her.
Louise. Louise. Please. Louise.
She screamed at its horrible face. It started muttering something before reversing out of the growing inferno. She saw a man's smile creep across the monster's face. It turned and...
Olivier, come closer. Olivier.
It's your mother. Olivier, come closer. It's all right.
Louise roared at the thing and charged. Expecting her reaction, it responded with incredible speed, whipping around to face her. Its huge jaws clamped down on her arm, nearly severing it. Her radius snapped with a pop, the flesh of her arm parting under its own weight. She went into shock from the pain, her body becoming rigid. Already, it began to gnaw, attempting to swallow anything it could. The jaws released with a grinding snap as a spear of flaming wood pierced its ballooning lungs. The hollow interior of the beast was revealed in the light, devoid of any visible organs. It reared up on its hoofed feet to grasp at the spear with its hands, struggling to pry it free. Matu leapt on its back, chopping at the spine with his axe. His face smeared with blood, he howled in a blind rage. Hacking off chunks of flesh surrounding the spine, he brought the beast back to the ground. The arms cracked and snapped themselves free of the shoulders, flailing wildly behind its back, where they clawed at Matu's face. He sliced one of the arms clean off at the shoulder and kicked the other until it was mangled and no longer moved. Still, the thing writhed and flexed, an animal pinned and holding on for dear life. He grabbed Louise's torch from the ground where she laid in a heap. With all the force his blood-streaked arms could muster, he drove the burning wood into the base of the skull and held it there until it no longer cried. Matu's vision blurred as he reached toward Louise, who tenderly held pressure on what remained of her arm. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized she would be unable to save him or herself. Matu's wounds were deep, his furs soaked through with red. Fresh spurts of blood warmed his skin. Just before his vision faded to black, Batu saw a group of lights emerging from the darkness. Louise must have noticed them too as she began shouting. Olivier was being held by the Spaniard, who rode into the clearing with several men at his back, carrying torches and muskets, most likely looking to find and hang the one who stole their horse. The men dismounted and ran towards Louise, carrying her out of the heat and smoke and tending to her arm. Several of them glanced at Matu and the monster lying next to them, their faces confused and horrified. Matu realized quickly that they had no intention of saving him, and he made his peace with it. Louise screamed in equal parts pain and sorrow as she was hoisted onto the back of a horse. Matu dragged himself away from the blaze before it consumed him, leaving behind the pale form of the monster to burn in the spreading flame. He clutched the wolf carving in his hand and smiled. Louise pleaded and struggled against her rescuers before she leapt from the horse, dragging herself towards him. The men followed after, their horses threatening to flee from the spreading fire. Batu felt Louise clutch his chest, refusing to let go. The Spaniard grabbed her and shouted over the roaring blaze, urging her to return. Then a new voice spoke above the others, silencing them. Batu felt a pair of hands lift his feet as another lifted him from his shoulders. His vision darkened as he saw a flash of a beaded necklace adorned with a cross dangling in front of his eyes. It was bright and carved from a pale wood he had never seen before. The man told him to have no fear, and that he was going to save him.